Yes, I'm glad to join you. Um, okay, so for my refrigerator, the Plectics gave me a couple of things to think about. One is they wanted me to talk about Xerox PARC and the ARPA model, what made it successful. They also wanted me to talk about uh, points of view and problem finding. Um, these overlap to a considerable extent. So, I mean, each of these is a good sized talk, but I've taken part of the points of view stuff and woven it in to the Xerox PARC and ARPA model thing. And then at the end, I have more things on points of view and uh, finding new ways to think. And many people in the audience will know some of this stuff. So I just want to remind you that we're remembering and reminding. I can't predict what I need to say to give you context, so I may say a few things you already know. Please forgive me. And then I always like to thank people ahead of time who have helped greatly in a talk because they tend to get lost at the end. And special thanks to Yevgenia. Uh, she sent me the best 4-page set of notes about what I could talk about that anybody has ever sent me. And it really made a big difference with this long a talk and to an audience that I do not completely understand. So Xerox PARC in the 70s, it's known for the first things like the Macintosh, basically network personal computers and so forth. It's known for the GUI. It's known for WYSIWYG and desktop publishing. The special kind of object-oriented programming we did there. It's known for the laser printer, the outline fonts and PostScript. It's known for the Ethernet, peer-to-peer and client-server computing, and maybe half of the internet design. And it's also was one of the earliest to instigate VLSI CAD. So we call these contributions rather than inventions. Most of the work was done by a small number of about 25 researchers. In days back then, it cost about $2 million to $3 million a year, we think. I don't know what it would cost today to do it, in part because the housing costs have changed out of scale with inflation. So it's very, very difficult to estimate. But the return is getting up to close to $100 trillion now. Because what was invented there was an industry rather than products. It was not a product lab. It was there to create a middle ground between tinkering in the present and doing extensive product development for mass manufacture. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I have a one slide summary of this talk. Now, this is not exactly a one slide summary. This is a thing I did for the internet at 50 a few years ago, and it's really only about how the internet happened. But it's way, way too complicated, as you can see. So we have to find some way of dealing with it. And this old fortune teller says, I tell the future nothing easier, but who can tell the past? Past is too detailed. It happened. Many, many things. Future can be very simple. It hasn't happened yet. And if you weren't there, you might not have context to understand. even some of the words that are used. For example, these words were very different back then. And I, being an old guy now, I still slip and use words in their original meanings. So there's some cause for confusion there. And then the request from Plectics was to talk about behind, not to talk about my career, but to talk about what was behind the things uh, that are still around today that shaped today. And if you look down below, you can see that a person who was in their 20s when the ARPA, uh, this research that we're talking about today started, was born before World War II. And a person who was in their 20s when Park happened was born just after World War II. I was born in 1940 and I was 30 in 1970. So if we look down below, we see that, Moore's law, which was talked about in 1965, has had 40 doublings since then, which is a scale factor of 1 trillion. So it means that many things that were extremely difficult to do back then are not even thought of today, like having more than 128K of memory. That was a lot of memory back then. Engelbart's demo was done on a machine that only had 192K. So when you have these exponentials, I will occasionally try and remind you what people were dealing with back then. And that leads me to this slide, which I put in rather late in this talk, but it got me to want to remind you that what was interesting about that period was that the things that were made, things that were out in the world, radios, TVs, and stuff like that, were still made out of elemental components that were mostly soldered together. And there are books like this for dealing with these components. And you could buy a kit to build your own oscilloscope. Now, $39.50 was a lot of money back then, so most of us would try to get our high school to buy this kit. But you actually built your own test equipment back then. And in high school, I learned how to make a vacuum tube because glass blowing physicists, for example, were still making their own instruments and blowing glass and putting stuff in there. Right. So this means you could make an AM radio from more or less stuff that was just lying around. You had to blow the glass, but you could blow it and you could make resistors and capacitors and so forth. And there was also in New York City, where I lived back then, were two long streets, Canal Street and Cortlandt Street, that had nothing but electrical surplus stores on both sides. A lot of them World War II surplus. So you could mow a couple of lawns. The subway was only a dime. You could go down there and come back with an armload of junk that you could do things with because everything was just soldered together. You could make a hi-fi amplifier that was as good as a Macintosh amplifier. It would stay that good for a couple of years. If you made a Tesla coil, you usually wound up making the capacitors for it. So, of course, people make things today, but the difference is that was an analog computer. Here's a cloud chamber. The difference is that the stuff that you were sticking together back then was stuff that you could make yourself if you really wanted to or had to. and you're dealing with elemental properties of things. And I realized when I was preparing this talk that this is really important to understanding the background of the people we're going to be talking about. This catalog here is from Edmund Scientific, which was in New Jersey, and they had about 4,000 hodgepodge of things. They sold telescopes, they sold magnets, they sold whatever you wanted. It was basically elemental stuff. And many of the people who fooled around with this stuff in junior high and high school went on to get college degrees. And it was critical that those undergraduate degrees were in really difficult things. And I'll explain in a bit why that was. Now, if we come back to the fortune teller here, the only way we can deal with this is with what Kahneman calls expository fictions, which we could think of as kind lies. So, for example, if you look on the right there, you can see that he took all the complexities of the human brain and reduced them to two parts. One part comprised all of the stuff that ran fast and all of the stuff that ran slowly. And he pointed out these weren't really even systems. I'm just taking two things, they aren't co-located. But in fact, he wrote a really great book. I commend that book to you if you haven't read it, just in examining what it means to have parts of your brain that are set up for running very, very quickly and what it means to have other parts running slowly. It will, if you are curious about AI, it will explain about a lot about what's being done and what's not being done with AI. And Einstein, when he was 5, recovering from a cold, was given a compass to play with. And his reaction was interesting. He said there is something behind things, something deeply hidden, because the compass did not distract him from wondering about what was causing the compass to do what it did. So you can think of that as kind of a shadow. Maybe if you look at the shadow, it's kind of, there are little fireflies down there. And you don't see them because you're distracted by the appearance of it. But if you take out the fireflies, they're kind of what you need to learn to pay attention when you do science. It's not the stuff in front of you because people have gotten how the world works quite wrong for hundreds of thousands of years by being distracted by the way things appear. And one way of thinking about science is you try and take these fireflies, which are the phenomena, and find a way of making a t-shirt out of them, like could be Maxwell's equations or something. Get it small enough so you can see it and still have some brain cells to think about it. And now we've made a map of something. It isn't the thing is still out there where we can't touch it. And the map is not the territory, as Korzybski said. And the guy who followed Korzybski in general semantics, Neil Postman, pointed out, and if you tell a story, you're only telling a path through this map. And so you're not even getting it. And I like the Plectics logo because it represents an attempt to tell multiple stories through the map, but you're still only getting a little of it. And then the fun thing is if you do this at all well, you get some shadows from this that have their own fireflies. And so the way of thinking we're going to be talking about here is along these lines. Now, if we go back to this too complicated thing again and we simplify it to just time periods, we have to notice that every era is going to have people of roughly the same abilities. There are going to be a small percentage of highly able people. And if the eras are different in their productivity, then we have to look for other places other than whether there were smart people there. There's always going to be smart people. So what happened? And one way to get from what Xerox PARC to what came by is I'm just going to go back into 1950 and start with Whirlwind, which today, because we call things a mini computer if their word length is short, this was a 16-bit machine, but it was the first really fast machine because it was a parallel machine. And it actually looked a bit like this. So is this big, so what, uh, and the control room looked like this. And we see it has a display. And it has a light gun, which can look at the display and effectively point at it. That was invented by this guy, Bob Everett. And Jay Forrester, who was head of the project, was so upset about the terrible memories that he was forced to invent core memory. And nowadays, core memory doesn't exist. But before this, the memories were extremely small, a few hundred bits, you were lucky, and they're extremely unreliable. So the core memory that Forrester invented made modern computing possible. It allowed large machines. And they used this display first to hook up to the MIT radar project, where a lot of the radar systems in World War II had been made, to see if they could track Russian bombers. And they were successful at being able to track planes. And so that led into this enormous project called Whirlwind 2 or SAGE. And to give you an idea of this was a concrete blockhouse. It's about this size. The bottom floor was all power supply and cooling. And these blockhouses were hooked together. They made 24 of these systems around the US. And on the second floor were two extremely large 50,000 vacuum tube computers running in tandem. And I'll leave it until we talk with the audience, the question of this to ponder. These systems stayed up. The last one was decommissioned in 1982. So my question is, where did they get the vacuum tubes to keep this system going? This started in the vacuum tube era, and by the time it ended, we were in transistors. Then on the top floor, there were 100 to 150 of these graphics terminals with members of the Air Force tracking planes. And John McCarthy, who was a mathematician consulting for IBM at the time, and IBM was the contractor on this project. They didn't design it, but they were the builders of it. And McCarthy looked at this and said, well, every home will have one of these. And why did he say that? Because this reminded him of attending an electric power plant or a waterworks, something that could be distributed, and these were hooked together by telephone. So he could see that you could have something like a utility model here, but it would have to have some different way of communicating with its users if it was going to work generally. And then this guy, who is a psychologist, said in not too many years, human brains and computing machines coupled together very tightly, the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought. So he was a big thinker. He could see that this could be something, could be complementary to the way humans think and make a big difference. And then at this time, Sputnik was flying overhead, and America got very frightened because the Russians had put a satellite in space and we hadn't yet. And we'll pick up that story in a little bit, but that the Russians could do this more or less obsoleted this huge project because it meant the Russians could send intercontinental ballistic missiles and tracking them did not help. But this project turned into something very useful, which was the air traffic control systems of the world, literally. They do track planes. Every airport has rooms and terminals like these. That's what happened to it. And to save face, the military kept this system going, as I said, until around 1982. Uh, Now, back then, the one of the biggest problems was nobody knew anything about computing. They were just poking around the outsides of it. They knew how to make computers. They knew that computers could be extremely general. Uh, they were just finding out that programming was really difficult. And Fortran was an effort to make a higher level language. So you were not really communicating machine code, but they didn't know how to do anything. And so this turned into a big project. IBM was, its strength was in doing enormous projects by brute force mostly. They used to say there are no style points in football. So their stuff was not pretty. It was not, even though they had very smart people with great mathematical backgrounds like John Backus, and these computers were slow. And compiling programs were really slow to the point where management in companies did not want to waste computer time by where you could have programmers at low wages write code. So here's a letter from one of the early users of Fortran. And I think this is the one that's worthwhile paying attention. So these are two different sets of basically 5 pages of code, 250 lines. And they require between 8 minutes to 20 minutes to compile. Well, this guy wrote the letter. Oh, and he said nobody wanted to recompile. So they would take these things and they would patch them in machine code. But he saw a future for it. So this is the way things were in the 50s. People were doing things because the military was paying for it in the Cold War, and there were big markets to be served, like the ones that IBM was trying to move in to from punch cards. But it was very difficult to get the computers to actually uh, produce value. So meanwhile, McCarthy's job at IBM was actually to think of a better way of doing Fortran or an add-on to Fortran to allow symbolic processing, not just processing numbers. And so he points out certain elementary verbal reasoning processes so simple that they can carried out by a feeble-minded human have yet to be simulated by a machine program. This is still true, right? So this is from 58. So this will be, I guess, 70 years old in 2 years, 3 years. And at the bottom here, he says, the procedures will be described as much as possible in the language itself, and in particular, the heuristics are also so described. So this would be akin not only to having today AI, which can't really do, it doesn't really reason, it just predicts from past experiences. This would be akin to explaining to the AI uh, better ways to go about doing its job. But because the AIs don't understand, you can't really do that. You have to improve the prompt at the level you're giving it. So this is this is a very big, and McCarthy, of course, was one of the guys who coined the term artificial intelligence. He was one of the people who started the field up. And this is a very interesting way of thinking about things. And John really, for thinking about an improved Fortran for this was unthinkable. He didn't know what he needed, but he knew he needed something much better. And so this gets us to what kind of thinking can we actually do in computing? Is it all just ad hoc? Is it ad hoc and patch? What kind of reasoning? And of course, what you want here, if you're going to think about it, is these five. You want to look at computers, but not see the computers and the programming languages of the day. You want to see the fireflies. You want to see kind of what they're emanating. And then you want to make a t-shirt. And so McCarthy made the first really great t-shirt about a programming language, which was a half page of code using the language as a meta language, making a language more powerful than any language that existed, and small enough so you could actually look at it and think about it. This is what it looked like. So this is kind of like Maxwell's equations for programming the first time around. And if you had a taste for this kind of stuff, understanding this major way of looking, this is a completely different perspective for thinking about what programming is all about. And as math, it's not necessarily real. As Einstein pointed out, he said the more math is certain, the less it's about reality, and the more it's about reality, the less it's certain. And so one of the guys working with McCarthy, Steve Russell, who also did the game Space War a little bit later, he said, well, that's a program. If I implement it, we will have a running system. And McCarthy said he did, and we did. And that running system gave them an artifact. So this is like making a bridge and then studying it as a scientist would study a bridge. What are, how do bridges actually work? We can make them brute force and by ad hoc, but if we make one, we can stress it, we can do various things to it, and we can have something like a science of bridges. And what McCarthy did here was something Newton-esque. He had found a way of not just improving programming, but improving thinking about programming. And as I said, once you do one of these things from the fireflies, they emit fireflies. And you'll find out what this funny star with the blue on the top and the pink on the bottom is in just a minute. So this is an example of what I call Goldilocks math. And basically, I think it's safe to say about most computer people over the whole time of computing is they don't understand math very well, and it's too little about math. It's mostly ad hoc, it's mostly tinkering, it's mostly patching. And of the few people who are sensitive to mathematical possibilities, many of them got attracted by classical math, set theory, and other things that are respectable because they're writing papers in universities. And most of this stuff led nowhere, and it just tied up a lot of talent. But as we'll see, most of the people I'm going to be talking about today were people who found the right place for doing mathematical thinking. And sometimes they had to invent new math in order to do mathematical thinking. But that turned out to be really powerful. And if you don't know who Hamming is, he's the reason we can send messages. He's the guy who first did error correcting codes and stuff. He's the third Turing Award winner. And he said something really interesting, worked with Shannon at Bell Labs. And he said, mathematics is an interesting intellectual sport, but it should not be allowed to stand in the way of obtaining sensible information about physical processes. Don't get misled by the math. If you're in the world, you're in the world, and you have to find some way of dealing with it. And this goes for tool building. Most computer people do way too little tool building, are not very good at it, they're afraid of it. And so their programming tools and other things to help them are astonishingly meager. Some of them are worse than what we used at Xerox PARC 50 years ago. That is incredible. On the other hand, the Turing tar pit is something you can get stuck in because if you can't do a tool in a timely way, you might wind up forgetting what your original project was. You're still feeding the tool 5 years later, and that project is not going to get done. So again, there's this happy medium that if you're going to make tools, you have to really be able to make them quickly and make them to be effective. So here's a slight generalization of this. We always see curves like this, and when they go up, we say yay, and then when they go down, we say boo. But if you think about it, this curve means absolutely nothing without a threshold. For instance, if the threshold is here, it looks like we're making progress. But this could be like reading scores in the US. Threshold is there. If you're not there, you're not reading. So it means it doesn't matter whether you're getting better or worse down below. You have to have a threshold. And we'll make pink and blue be the dividing lines, and we'll recognize that the boundary is a little blurry as to where you move from one of these to the other. And an argument could be here is, hey, look, the progression here is upward. We're eventually going to get into the blue doing this. This is what they say in reading. But most things, as you move along in the future, are the thresholds for goodness move upward. For instance, we have to read better now than we did in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century. And we're not doing it. So we're lagging behind. And up here is too much, and down here is too little. It's too incremental down there. And so a good slogan is better and perfect are the enemies of what is actually needed. What is actually needed for any practical project is what you need to shoot at. And that's where that funny looking star comes. It's 1 foot in the pink mundane, 1 foot in the blue new world. That's where you want to be. And if you do that, you can get catapulted into a world of qualitatively different thoughts than people are having down in the pink area. And notice the learning curve, you're usually starting off down below there and fighting your way up there is really tough. I think this might be a better explanation of this. So here's a pink plane, and let's imagine our thoughts as being like an ant. The ant is roaming around, it's avoiding obstacles. It doesn't even know it's in a pink area because its nervous system is looking for differences like all nervous systems do, and everything is pink. So it has no idea it's in water if it's a fish, or it's in pink if it's an ant. But every once in a while, when you're waking up or taking a shower or something, or out for a run, you can get an outlaw thought. But you went to school, you have parents, you went to church, no blue thoughts allowed. But what if you have one anyway? You might get a kerpow. Everybody has had one of these. You're looking at something and all of a sudden you see it in a new way. And that kerpow brings with it a different world of thought. This is a big idea because things work differently in this world And it might be a way of dealing with things much better than you were in the pink world. But you have to realize if pink means sane, blue means insane. And what about green? Well, we missed an opportunity to, there was an obstacle here that could have gotten us into a green way of thinking about things to go after it. But no, we missed it. And so this is something that I will talk about a little bit more later. But Hamming again, and this is a big one. He said it is better to do the right problem the wrong way than the wrong problem the right way. What did he mean by that? He meant that if you're doing the right problem, you're in the right place. The right problem exists, is you're already in the blue. And making mistakes there is going to just have you learn more. That is a good place to be in. But if you're doing a wrong problem, you're in the pink. And if you're doing it the right way, you might be misled into thinking you're making progress, whereas you're not. I think much of computing is in that second place because the commercialization of computing made things extremely conservative in most fruitful ways. Okay, Sputnik again. And Americans were frightened. That's when they do things. So they beat on President Eisenhower and he formed the ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. And notice what he says at the bottom: to expand the frontiers of technology and science and able to reach far beyond immediate military requirements. All the directors of ARPA were scientists. And one of the first things Jack Ruina did when he got in there was to hire this fellow we saw just a few slides ago, Licklider, to set up the computing research, which is called the Information Processing Techniques Office. And Licklider was a very wise, very intuitive guy. So one of his first principles was visions are not the same as goals. We can't think of any goals here in Washington. It's too much noise. But we can come up with visions. And if somebody asks me about what the ultimate cat toy is, I'll answer it later. And here is what he would say whenever you ask, what are you doing? He said, well, computers are destined to become interactive intellectual amplifiers for everyone universally networked worldwide. And people said, how are you going to do it? And he says, well, I don't know. But I'm going to give money to smart people who think they do. So this was like putting a magnet for humans on the other side of a mountain range. And all the iron particles could feel it, and from their own places, they could line up more or less pointing at it, but in different ways. So I think this is the most important lesson here. The goodness of the results will correlate most strongly with the goodness of the funders. This is the answer to the question of all different eras having smart people. It is basically, and it's not how much money they have. There's more money being spent on computing now than ever before, but it's the way the money is spent. It's how the funders relate to it and to the research that made the big difference in the 60s and the 70s. So this is the number one slogan here to pay attention to. And they essentially, without coming up with goals, they were interested in what does it mean for humans and computers to work together? And especially, what does it mean to augment human intellect? Okay, while this was going on, and this is one of the couple of the aisles in one of those big air defense computers. And down at the end, there's a very special guy who was a grad student who was given this machine 3 hours a day. We can see what he's doing here. So this display could only plot dots. So the first thing he had to do was to make a program for doing lines. Now you can see he's pointing to these lines. He's going to say, I want you to be either horizontal or vertical, whichever is closer. And lo and behold, Sketchpad did that for him. Now he's zooming in. He has knobs there, and he's actually painting on a huge canvas. So this is the first system with a window and a clipping and a zooming window. He does the same trick here. He says, I want you to be horizontal or vertical while still sticking to those lines. And these dashes are using these lines as guidelines because they're sticking to them automatically. Now he's going to make the guidelines transparent. He's got a hole in his flange here. And he says, okay, I need a rivet to put in that hole. So he just sketches one. He says, I want the center of this arc to be on both of those lines. And now I'm going to do the same thing I did before, horizontal or vertical. And notice that's just going to drag those lines, which is going to drag the arch, which is going to give us a rivet. So try doing that in PowerPoint. And we see something else, that drawing of the rivet was a master drawing, what we'd call a class in object-oriented programming today. So this little rivet here is an instance. It can be moved around. He can make more instances. So far, it looks like he's just copying and scaling, but he realizes, oh, I don't like the cross in the rivet. I'll go to the master drawing and change the master so the cross pieces are transparent, and lo and behold, all of the rivets have that. Another thing you can't do in PowerPoint. So this is ridiculous, right? And anything that you make can be made into a master. So you can make instances of them. So this was really the first object-oriented system, and it was better than most. So you can think of this as not just something like OOP, but it's OOP that has global constraints that allows you to control the system and still use the properties of objects. Here are some drawings from his thesis that were done on the system and plotted out. You can see the characters there, rubber band lines that you saw, gravity fields that if things are close, they will jump to the thing, two-handed operation, knobs for zooming. And a critical one is the constraint solution is the closest one that works to the sketch that you made. And that is a big deal. Well, how did he get those characters in there? Here they are. And see, there's a bunch of T's in there, and there's a master drawing of a T. There it is. We zoom in on it. We got a rivet. Now what we're going to do is to change the T. We're going to constrain the rivet to follow the T, and now here's what the text looks like. Bingo. Pretty cool. And here's what looks like a bridge And one of the most important things about this work in 62 was that Ivan went from initially trying to imitate paper, which is mostly what we do today, to realizing, well, it's a computer, it's a dynamic thing after all. Can we go beyond what we use in the present day? Like, can we do something like this? So these are the elements of the bridge that were made by putting lines together. They're stuck together when they get close. We're opening them up so we can see. We're using our text now to display basically the amount of stretch and pull on these. These are anchors because we want the bridge to be suspended from each end. We're going to put a weight here and tell the weight to go down to the ground. So you can see the sketchpad is reacting to changes and showing us what kind of situations put special strain on the bridge. So Ivan not only did one of the very first CAD systems, certainly the first graphics computer-aided design system, but he also did the first CAD sim, not just designing on the thing, but testing out physical properties on it. So this system caused a sensation in the research world because it was kind of the invention of graphics, Windows, objects, masters, and instances, constraint solving, dynamic simulations, a real GUI for the first time. And so I asked Ivan, Ivan came to Utah where I was a grad student. I said, Ivan, how could you have done, this is his PhD thesis at MIT. I said, how could you have done all of this in 1 year with all these inventions? And well, he said, well, I didn't know it was hard. And Sketchpad upped the level, gave us a different sense of where the threshold should be because this was like a 4 minute mile vastly surpassed. And all of a sudden, it's like, well, if it's an interactive system, it shouldn't be less than this, should it? Even though it was done on this enormous computer that was the building that it was in, everybody could see that this would eventually be done in a few years on much more affordable machines. So again, this idea of Goldilocks math is used here. So it was mathematical, but the maths is a plural for a reason, because you can invent math every time you need it. The maths we have today were not the maths that they had in the 18th century or 17th century or 16th century. So a big deal is if you got to do math, you need to be able to invent maths. So we give Ivan a star for that. And Burroughs didn't like IBM or Fortran. And a new language, Algol 58, which was much, much nicer than Fortran, had come along, and they loved it. And they didn't want to do a big, difficult, slow compiler for it. And if you look on this listing here, you can see a famous name, Don Knuth. Here's what he looked like back then. And so they had to put some real thought into this compared to the way IBM had done it. And they came up with a compiler that could run faster than the input devices. This was a Goldilocks math system. And I saw this when I was in the Air Force in 1961. And here's another thing I saw, which was a really neat scheme for dealing with the fact that there weren't operating systems back then. A tape would start off with pointers into the second part, which were procedures, which knew about the third part, which were data records. And if you squint the right way, you can see that that first part is like what we call a class in object-oriented programming. And the second part is like what we call instances of it. And so here's another way of thinking about this idea. Hardly anybody used it, even though it meant that you could send the thing that you didn't have to do a lot of documentation of the records and everything because the procedures knew what they were. And the pointers in the beginning were in a standard order and were basically the API for it. So this is a great idea that mostly got unnoticed. So I'm just going to quickly try and get you to see a few things about uh, this transformation from really difficult tools to fairly easy tools. So for instance, if your code says A and B, A or B or C or D, you have a problem that after you've gone through the A could be some expression. The thing you want to do is to have a jump on true past the D, but you don't know where that's going to be in the code. So this is one of the reasons they would have multiple pass compilers. You could find out these things in earlier passes and take care of them on later passes. But the Burroughs people thought up, every time we get to one of these places where we don't know, we could backchain. So the backchain, it starts in the one after A, and when we get to the B one, we can put a pointer to the A one in there and et cetera, tie it to the parse. And that means that once we get to where we want to go, then we just follow the chain backwards and put it in. So it's a one-pass compiler. I'm just going to skip this. You really have to read about this guy, Bob Barton, Wikipedia. I'll get completely in the weeds, but this is several of the most significant things done in computing. And many of them are used today in software form. So the problem of tools here, the grammars are first described just in text as descriptions. Somebody realized, oh, but if we looked at this the right way, it could be looked at as a program that the program for primary is go to the procedure called number and see if it's there. And if it's not, you fail and come back and look for so it could be a program. And if you have procedures following the syntax procedures for generating code or being interpreters or something like that, all of a sudden you've added meaning to this program. And these one-pass techniques help. And here's what it looks like the first time out. It was done on an IBM 1401, which had a 48-character set. So it's not nearly as readable, but if you squint at it, you can see it's very similar to the program to the left. The semantic routines are saying out, and that's putting out some code. And here's a subset of algol that you can do in a couple of hours. That does this parsing, and here's the little virtual machine. It's like a little Burroughs B5000, but in code, you can write that in a couple of hours, and you can write a program and compile it and get output, and bingo. In an afternoon, you've done yourself a programming language. Not days, not months, not years. So this was a revelation to those who paid attention to it. Now, here's the big deal. The big deal is, well, the compiler itself is a program and it has a syntax. I was using it. So what if I describe it in itself and I write a virtual machine language for running its operators? And now maybe it takes 2 days instead of an afternoon, but all I have to do is implement the thing on the right, hand compile the thing on the left, run it through the system once, and all of a sudden I've got it in itself on my new computer. So this way of thinking was at least as important as the notion of tools, as the need for languages. It was basically the ideas, oh yeah, this is just like I need a tool for my lathe. I'll just grind one rather than trying to source one out and find it or buy it from somebody or something. It's just a whole different way of thinking about things. And it was a really important, serious Goldilocks. So Lick was now at ARPA, and you notice it's 1963. And look, here's a memo he wrote, members and affiliates of the Intergalactic Computer Network. Now, why did he call it intergalactic? He said, because engineers always give you the least. I want a worldwide network, so I'm asking them for an intergalactic one. That shut everybody up. And he said, if we succeed in making an intergalactic network, the main problem will be learning to communicate with aliens. And he meant any two things that are separated are likely to be different enough so that they're not going to have enough in common to communicate. Could be machines to machines. It could be humans to humans. And here's what he set up. He set up 14 university projects and 6 research corporations that already existed with funding. And here are the two trade-offs. Universities encourage they like thesis projects to be original, but solo. They want the kid to do it all by himself and original. And corporate research could do things in groups, but because of what corporations actually are, they're very wary of new ideas. So they didn't want to take chances. And so but these are both still huge problems today. And Lick decided to subvert both of these. So what he did is fund entire departments. He didn't want rivalries in the universities. So he just fund the entire department. So he didn't want professors competing with other professors for graduate students. He did want universities to work on large projects. And with companies, what he did is he said, I'll only give you this money if you can prove to me that you're going to do new things. I don't want typical corporate stuff here. You need to take chances. And so this was a way of subverting the two main ways that things don't get done well today. Okay, let's quickly now look at the famous mouse and realize that the same year the mouse was invented, a fabulous tablet was also invented. The mouse cost about $15 to make, and you could buy a tablet from Rand for $18,000 back then, which is like 130 or 140,000 today. The mouse was crap. The tablet was great, but the ratio in what it cost to get one was daunting. So these two groups, both in California had very different ways to think about user interface, and both groups turned out to be correct in the end. So Engelbart's project, which is called NLS, was new ways of thinking, train the human, new system, train the human to use it. It's like inventing a new music with a new musical instrument. Let's invent new musicians and teach them how to play the instrument. And the RAND project had kind of the opposite thing. They already had tons of RAND analysts there who already did things and already knew things. And so their idea was, well, let us supercharge what they can do. Let us see if we can augment what they do and require minimal training. So we'll look at this one first. So I urge everybody to read this document. This is Engelbart's first thing he wrote for the first funding he got. It is full of really deep ideas. He knew about Sketchpad, so this was in his original thought. You're going to have a display about like this, and the light pen, the blood runs out of your hand when you're using it, so you probably should suspend it overhead and let the guy pull it down, and et cetera, et cetera. But here's something that almost nobody has really paid attention to, and that is that tools, even powerful tools, only teach us how to use them. So for instance, a hammer is for hammering things, and using it to hammer things gets you into a hammering way of thinking about solving things. And Engelbart realized this is really a dangerous loop, because unless you insert, as our tools get more and more powerful, that unless you insert education and training in between, you're going to create something really, really dangerous. And those words are really even more dire today than they were 63 years ago. Maybe you can soften, give the human more wisdom about how the tools are used, and then modern methods and techniques can be used more safely and for advancing things. So I urge anybody who's doing technology to read this. And while this was going on at Berkeley, across the bay, a guy by the name of Dave Evans started a project to do a lightweight, really efficient, inexpensive time-sharing system. And these were three of the people who worked on it. We'll learn more about them in a bit. Dave went to Utah in 65, and Butler became head of this project. And so this won't mean anything to anybody. This became the SDS 940, but it did become the ARPA standard machine. It was so good. And it made Engelbart's system and demo possible. It's a system that Engelbart used. And we'll leave it here and note that the SRI people used one of these Meta2 compilers, were able to do a special higher level language for this machine that only took 6 man-months to do, and vastly changed the ratio of what it meant to program a complex system on it. And in 1968, the big demo was here. I was sitting here. Here's what it looked like.
As I say, I had to go to Produce, but I'd like to go to Produce. They get big. I'd like to say one branch only, and they look just that low. And I see it. Oh, I can say I'd like to see one line only. I can see it. But there's a little thing I can do. There's a root I said I have here. So here, I'm afraid I'll need a different picture of the view. So here's what I do with a picture drawing capability, or it's a slight map. I start from work, and here's the route I seem to have to go to pick up all the materials. And that's my plan for getting home tonight. But if I want to, I can say, the library, what am I supposed to pick up there? I can just point to that. Oh, I see, overdue books and all. Well, there was a statement there with that name on it. Go back. What am I supposed to pick up at the drugstore? I see, there's saying. All right. All right. These things, if I want to just say, I'd like to interchange produce and canned materials. Bingo. They're all good right here. I care to look. Interchanging them very quickly. Cans are going to get interchanged with produce. They do it and all gets renumbered.
Yeah, okay, so that caused a sensation, but very little change in industry. But the computer scientists saw it, had just seen hyperlinking, they'd seen multiple windows, they'd seen many things there. And another thing they showed there was the fact that part of Engelbart's plan was not to augment single people. He wanted to augment groups because groups are the effective organization for making important things happen. So his thought was, well, you need something similar to what you have for a human. The group has to be educated, it has to be wise about the tools and so forth, and the system should help facilitate the communication. So this turned out to work so well that they used the system even when they were having meetings in a room together. Here they all are. They had a program.
I see it over like that. It leaves a corner up there, and I say, now computer, do the automatic switching that'll bring in a camera picture from the camera mounted on his console, such as the camera mounted on mine is.
So this,
Bill. That's great. Now we're connected to audio. You can see my work. You can point at it. I can see your face, and we can talk. So let's do some collaborating.
this guy is located in Oregon.
A directive file and see what the directive is to get Roman numeral page numbers. I'm into the file now. Here's the first level of the hierarchy. So open up page.
Now, an important thing to realize here is that this looks superficially what we're doing right now, but complete sharing was built into the operating system of this system. So everybody had their own cursor. And if you had more than two people collaborating, their initials showed up on the cursor. Everybody could deal with things at once. So it was really a collaborative space in all ways. This doesn't exist in any of the main operating systems today, and it only exists in a few applications. So this is a big, important idea that got completely missed. I'll just point out to the Plectics people who like multiple disciplinary stuff is they can read about a lot of the disciplines that went into this. This is from that 1962 document. And here are the references. So the top yellow ones are cybernetics. General semantics is the next one. Memex by Bush. A lot of computer stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And Ivan Sutherland is mentioned in here, but he hadn't written his thesis yet. So he didn't wind up in these references, just in the text. So this was a quintessential multiple points of view system. Okay, now let's quickly look at the the Rand way of looking at things. So this guy Clishaw said about the analysts, well, they can read, they can write, they can do mathematics. He asked the question, could we make a system where they'd be willing to use math? Because they're already experts in something else. There was a computer they were going to junk. They're an old Johnny-ack. He said, give it to me and I'll see what I can do with it. They were used to putting stuff in their ring leaf. basically they studied the users, and Shaw basically asked, if we made this really pleasant, would they actually use it? So you can see it types out in green, and the user types in, and it's on drilled paper. The answer turned out to be yes, this is a fantastic system. And this led to this paper, which everybody who has any interest in user interface should read. It is the first great paper on user interface, and it's still great. The last sentence of it is, in this designer's view, the acceptance of an open shop computing system depends on the little things, hundreds of them. And that is still true today. So here's a nice, this is komorebi. This is a Japanese word. Japanese have one word for the sun shining through the trees. I just love it. But this is the closest thing I could find as to what it felt like back then, to know you're going to be able to use this system for an hour in the afternoon. This rarely affects, most computer systems do not make people feel as good. Okay, so the guy who did the special typewriter, Tom Ellis, decided to do a raid on wastepaper baskets at midnight. So he looked to see what the RAND analysts were throwing away. What were they actually doing? They never will tell us exactly what they're doing, but we can find out by finding out what they're throwing away. And a lot of it were these flow diagrams. So in 64, he invented this fabulous tablet. They got a guy to be able to recognize what the tablet had, and the tablet itself got a gold star here, but take a look at this. So drag and drop. Course menus. Here's what inking looked like. Notice there's no jitter on this. This display ran $200,000. But now look at this. He wants to get rid of a connector, so he just scrubs it. Now he drags it out of the way, shows that he wants a box, and it recognized he wants a box and makes one. Now it's recognizing his handwriting. This is where modern day window control came from, literally. It's sensitive to what you're looking at, so it knows he wants an arrow there. Scrub that. Scrub that. Now notice it makes an error here, but he can just fix it. Makes another one, but he's on the way there. It's modeless, so it's okay. Does that action, and he fixes up the F into an end. And of course, they did the system in this system. So McCarthy and Minsky had an AI group at MIT, and we went through these papers and saw how Lisp got done. And Warren Titleman was a grad student who did a very friendly system for doing complicated things. And he was the guy who invented undo and redo and spelling correction and other things. And I hope somebody asks me a question about what happened to undo when we get to the Q&A. He later came to Park. Okay, well, Congress, of course, as the 60s wore on, Congress completely ignored what Eisenhower said and started badgering these guys. How is this relevant? Tell me why this work it's doing is relevant to the Department of Defense. And they responded, well, that's not the right question to ask. Right question to ask is, how is this going to help the country or this technology or society or culture generally? And Bob Taylor here said they would stand up to these guys in a polite, civilized way, attack their myopia, because these ARPA directives were scientific statements. And in 66, Charlie Hertzfeld said to Taylor, what do you want? Taylor said, this network. Hertzfeld said, you got it. He said that was literally a 15-minute conversation. Hertzfeld asked how much money needed to get it off the ground, and $1 million or so just to get it organized. That's like 7 or 8 today. Hertzfeld said, okay. And Taylor's comment was there's no ARPA order written or anything for months, maybe even a year. That is how the ARPANET, which turned into the internet, got started. No bullshit. It was all done. Congress was not consulted. And a significant thing here is that Taylor went on from ARPA to become the director of the computing research at Park. And we'll find out his adventures in a minute. So the ARPANET was actually a lot of people, which I will not go through here. The American side was doing this. And over here is NPLNet, which was done in England. Davies and Roberts collaborated. They both got their ideas from Barron and Kleinrock. Wes Clark was the guy who did the computer that Ivan Sutherland did his thesis on, but he also did the first routers. Bob Kahn is mostly famous for being the co-inventor of TCP/IP. He was a coordinator on this project, and so a lot of things got done here to do the ARPANET. And these two guys wound up at Park. Now here's a really fun guy who is a researcher from the Boston area. He gave a paper in Japan, came back through Hawaii, had never surfed, but saw a surfboard for rent and rented it, and basically never left. His son related that Norm surfed pretty much every day of his life after that. But he was a researcher at the University of Hawaii, which is on Oahu here. And the problem was they wanted to do time sharing and they wanted terminals and stuff like that, but telephones here were really expensive. And so they hit on this idea, well, what about radio? And of course, radio has the problem that if two sides broadcast at the same time, you're going to get gobbledygook. So they built a system that would detect collisions. If they detected collisions, they would send out on a return channel, everybody delay your own, generate a random number yourself and delay that amount. That would tend to spread these things out and try again. And it worked extremely well. Called the AloaNet, and we just absolutely loved it. Well, Dave Evans had wound up at Utah, where the main project was to invent computer graphics imaging, which they did. So both Pixar and Adobe came out of Utah. I went to grad school with both of those guys. And the first thing I had to do when you got there was to learn about Sketchpad. I had to make similar work on the mainframe. The ARPANET was being talked about. We just saw Project Genie. We had a terminal there. I showed you this file system. Once you start thinking about masters and instances in a general way, you realize abstractly they were all just little machines on a single, like a transmission line. Abstractly, you could model anything. You could have a single computer model the number 3 if you wanted. It wouldn't be practical, but if you're thinking mathematically, you don't have to be practical. And I just loved the simplicity of this. And then a couple of months later, Dave introduced me to an engineer out in an aerospace company, and we spent the next couple of years making this machine. This is a self-portrait on its own display. And while I was doing that, I met Seymour Papert, and who was doing really great work with kids, and that caught my deep interest. And I started thinking about what would a computer for children be like. And once you think about children as users, it's a thing that gets you from the pink world you're in into the blue world, because children are very different and have very different needs, and get you to think about what computing is in a very different way. So that was a big deal. And Licklider and Taylor wrote a paper about communication. The computer is a communications device. You should find it and read it. So here's a cartoon that shows the combination of Engelbart and Sketchpad. The idea the computer could clean up your love letters. This is the device they called an Oliver, a robot assistant who would protect you and so forth. Okay, remember these guys back at Berkeley. So this Project Genie machine went on because it was in the ARPA community. When more powerful computers came along, like the PDP-10, the ARPA community made an operating system like Butler's on it, which was called 10X. And this launched the commercial time-sharing industry. And they eventually formed a company called the Berkeley Computer Corporation. They made a machine that was really fantastic. It was all microcoded, had 6 processing elements. Now, this slide is a slide I made up to show a pathway from Whirlwind up to the Dynabook. And this is not the story I'm telling today. So these are things that I have omitted to talk about today in order to talk about the larger community. So another time, perhaps. And Taylor especially had been thinking about, why did ARPA work so well? It was Licklider's instincts, but Taylor could formulate them into principles. So the 70s came along, and Taylor could remember the Vietnam War was going on. There were protests. College students were being shot by the National Guard on campuses back then. Could happen again, but it was a terrible situation. Taylor felt that Congress was going to overreact to this about defense funding. And so he went off to try and find a different way to get this stuff funded in case something happened. And he found Xerox. They'd recently got a chief scientist. This guy was from Brooklyn. He was a card player. He smoked cigars. I was lucky to have gone to high school in Brooklyn and play poker. So he said, look, you got to do a long-range research center as far away from corporate headquarters as possible and near a major R1 university. And a fellow physicist was head of the Washington University at St. Louis. And he got him to run this new research lab. Where would it be? In Stanford or Berkeley or UCLA. And Washington University of St. Louis happened to have an ARPA project, so Paik knew Taylor and hired him to set up the computing at Park. And Taylor, of course, had two reactions. What great people can I convince to leave, especially the universities, to work for a company? And would you please sign a legal agreement with certain stipulations on it? And Taylor again wanted to subvert. So the Xerox headquarters were in Rochester and Connecticut. And so the idea is let's get it as far away as possible. And when 1972 rolled around, yep, the Kersplat came down and the D got put on and everything changed. But it was too late because Taylor had already set up Park. So his way of looking at things is you're setting up a culture. Moore's law means you can make a time machine. We'll find out what that means in a minute. Person is the first word in personal computer. You better understand. This is why it's nice having psychologists being the instigators of these things. Living lab, we'll find out what that means. And we're in Palo Alto. Palo Alto was bike, Stanford, the Free U, Chinese food, Hewlett Packard. Stanford was here. This map, the blue things are the bike lanes. Park was there. The Free U was about 100 and maybe 25 different little storefronts along El Camino and University Avenue with alternate cultures. So it was a counterculture university. So Park was bikes. That's what it looked like inside there. And Park was part of the counterculture. And one way of understanding the counterculture is to look at the whole Earth catalog. And I wish this was one of the most important books ever done. It actually won the National Book Award in 1972. And the first 500 books in the Park Library came out of this catalog. They asked me, what should we get? And I said, well, the first thing we could do is just buy everything the Whole Earth store has, which was right across the street in those days from Engelbart's lab. Park was thick carpeted floors and beanbags. And then a lucky thing happened. There was a business downturn and Berkeley Computer Corporation had to go out of business. And Taylor was able to convince most of the people to come over in one fell swoop. And all of a sudden these guys were especially important. We went from not having a critical mass to a serious critical mass of computerists. My reaction was, holy shit. I was consulting for Taylor at the time. I was on my way to CMU, but I stuck around to see what was going on here. And so this is a larger view of that room. Huge early agreements. There was never ever a discussion about what we were going to do, only how to. Park would be an extended ARPA project just funded by Xerox. That was part of what Taylor's legal agreement with Xerox was about, publication and interacting with colleagues outside. Time machines, we'll see that in a second, but we could see that trying to buy other people's hardware and software was just going to slow us down because we spend most of our time doing workarounds. And then Butler came up with a very controversial one, which he more or less bludgeoned us into agreeing to, which is let's not do single demos that the demoer can barely demo. and we're not a product company, but let's do enough engineering on these things so that whatever we do, we can make 100 replicas. So if we do a piece of hardware, we have to be able to do 100 of them. We have to be able to serve 100 people. The software has to be documented outside the group that did it. And so this is one that took a while for him to get us to agree to, because we thought it would slow us down. And in fact, it sped us up, sometimes remarkably. And somebody can ask me why later. And then a crisis came up almost immediately. So here's the setup here was, this is around 1970, the ARPANET had expanded. Notice all communications lines are at least 50 kilobit capacity. That was a lot in those days. We were going to be on it. And there's Norm over in Hawaii saying, hey, what about me? And the standard ARPA community computer was a DEC PDP-10, which unfortunately happened to be a competitor of a company that Xerox had bought a few years earlier. And so Xerox said, absolutely no way are you going to get a DEC mainframe in here. It's either a Sigma 7 or nothing. And so that led to the meeting that we called, should we all just quit right now? Taylor said, should we get a Sigma 7? And Butler said, this OS is no good and the hardware is poor. What about writing a new operating system? And Butler, who was one of the best operating system designers in the world, said, you need at least 2 to 3 years to do it, and it won't be able to run some of the large AI programs we want to be able to run from BPN. Chuck pointed out, we can make a virtual PDP-10, make the hardware instead of the software that could run 10x. We could probably do that in less than a year. Butler, we can make it out of the first VLSI memories from Intel and learn about them. They are unreliable and poorly tested. Chuck said, Dick and I could make better test equipment for Intel than they have now. Dick piped up, okay. We can make a much more reliable virtual PDP-10 than DEC's actual machine. We can make this a real emulation machine. Ed Fiala could write the microcode. So that changed. Butler instantly decided, well, we should do this. What about the disk drives? And Ed McCrite said, well, I'll do them. And Butler said, well, Peter can do a much better kernel. And Peter Deutsch said, okay. Taylor said, well, you better get this done in less than a year or we're all toast. And everybody said, oh, absolutely. So I was sitting over here with another holy shit. Because this was not really what anybody had come to Park to do, which is to do a mainframe that was going to do time sharing. The idea was to do distributed networked computing, but we had to have a PDP-10. So yes. Then another fascinating conversation that I was present at was between Chuck. He said, I want to make a machine that just won't crash. We have to do much more because Intel's flaky chips. And Butler said, yeah, well, you can have much more memory and you can take a third of it offline and still have a full PDP-10 address space. So you can test a third of it continuously and probably find most memory errors before they actually happen. And he said, we should have a computer for the console so we can programmably control all the extras we'll be doing. And yeah, we can use a Nova 800 for that. I'm going to be really busy with the memory system. Who should we get to do the CPU? And Butler said, well, just fix things so I won't have to use an oscilloscope and I'll do it. And Butler said, well, have you ever done a big hardware design? And Butler said, well, no. So here's the crux of it. This is what core memory looked like back then. And these Intel chips were only 1,024 bits per chip, but they were smaller and the electrical engineering was much, much better. You had to do a few things. They had to be poked because they were dynamic RAMs. And that gives you these are 48 of these, so it's 12K bytes. They got to work. Here's looking at this thing from the other side. 16 boards per package there. So it was basically 32K 48 bits words. I thought the PDP-10 was a 36-bit machine, but the extra bits were used for tag bits. They're used for many detecting and correction bits. So this memory was designed a little bit more like a CD. You may or may not know this, but a CD-ROM or a DVD has about a quarter of the bits on it just there as error correcting code bits. And so this is one of the first time anybody went to that length for this machine. And the bottom line was 9+ months later, up it came. It had the record for the longest continual stretch on the ARPANET, about 10 years of uptime. Basically, it didn't crash because it never got taken down. You just took things out. The Nova could re-switch things dynamically while things were running. So that was a big star. And oh yeah, how about those homegrown disk drives? Yep. So if anybody wants a little bit more, because it looks impossible for one person to do this, and these were stock disk drives, and Ed did all the electronics and the head seeking and everything else like that. And they work nicely. So basically, summing up Park, the only time we voted at Park was for new researchers. And that was a ploy of Taylor because he did not want to have rivalries. There's a lot of egos around, and he wanted everybody to just love the new person before they came in. This worked extremely well. It got past one of the main problems you have when you set up a lab full of stars. He was a psychologist. He wasn't a computer person. So the whole structure was to have a group process that would actually come to conclusions. And his big deal was, he said, look, many of these people are lone wolves. My job is to set up the culture so when they need to cooperate, they will. That was what he did. And that is what happened. So the first question is, why were there two computer research labs at Park? And the answer was that there are actually two more labs. There was optics and physics. So when it started up, there were three labs, and Taylor worried that when Xerox had a business downturn, that they would not allocate on priority, which of course he thought the computer people were the top priority. He thought they would allocate equally amongst the three labs when the resources were scarce. And so he very early on convinced Xerox to set up a parallel system science lab, which he proceeded to stock with ARPA people. My group was over there. Bill English down there was from Engelbart's group. And so there were actually two labs. And Taylor was completely right. When Xerox had a downturn a few years later, they allocated equitably. But Taylor now had half of Park. And because of the democratic process, he wasn't ruling anything. But he was stocking it with people from the same culture and everything. And this worked out marvelously well. And I take it as a point of pride that my group was regarded by everybody else as the lunatic fringe. I will not explain further at this point. But remember this tools thing? Every group here did their own programming languages because they could just do it. Everybody did their own tools. And then later on, Lynn Conway, who was really great, joined. And there were some learning curve things. So one of the things we hated about computer displays is they were unreadable. So Ben Laws and I and Bill English built a system to explore making really good-looking fonts. So these are the first good-looking fonts that were done. Okay, can't even see the scan lines here. And we found that many things in Tom Cornsweet's book were true, but there's a different set of numbers and curves for displays compared to paper. You could experiment with different fonts. So here's a Pittman phonetic font. Here's a handwriting font. We like those for doing memos in because they look much less official, felt less official. Now, we also had a guy by the name of Gary Starkweather there who had more or less gotten thrown out of the Xerox labs in Rochester because they didn't believe in lasers. And he wanted to do laser printing. So coming out to Park was his last chance at Xerox. And we loved this guy completely. He was an engineer's engineer. And the way the laser printer worked was there was a laser, really high-powered ruby laser. There's an optical modulator, which I won't go into the details, but it wiggled the beam a little bit. And to get a signal to run into this thing, Gary had a coax into my lab. So I could feed him a page of text, but in a much higher resolution, into the thing, and he would just print it out. And for scanning the beam, this was a octagonal mirror that was spun at 24,000 revolutions per minute. And he had to run this fast because the only Xerox machine that Xerox would give him to run on was the most expensive one, which they were not renting as much, so they had a few around. So he had to run this thing at a page a second, and he shot for 500 pixels to the inch. Now, the thing is, most people today have never used a computer printer that runs this fast, right? So we're talking about, think about it. You could start it off and walk down the hall and it would print a 100-page document by the time you're there. Now I have to tell a Gary story, and this is too good to skip. So Park was originally down by Porter Drive there, and then they split. They were going to build a place near Coyote Hill Road, but they bought a building up on the hill here. And how was Gary going to get his bits? Our character generator machine was up here and his printer was down here. And you couldn't run a coax across the road. You needed 100 megabits per second. And so he asked Xerox, well, how about microwave? And the stuff that you could get reliably was 8 megahertz television microwave channels, and he needed 12 and a half of them. And no way was Xerox going to spend that money. And so Gary hardly paused a beat. Because remember that Edmund Scientific Catalog in New Jersey? Well, he had done things using this when he was a kid also. And he looked in there, and there was a reflecting telescope for $425. And he didn't have to resolve anything. So he figured, hey, boy, this could actually work. So he got it. He set up a laser up on the hill, pointed it at this thing, and got a 100 megahertz optical link. Now, the capper on this story is one night it didn't work. It had been raining. So he and I went up to the roof, and the roof hadn't drained properly. And so the place where the laser was resting had depressed a little from the water that hadn't drained off. And so the beam had drifted off to the side. So this is why I call this guy the engineer's engineer. And this is a really good way of understanding how the people who did things thought about doing things and did things. They just did them. Okay, now here's a sad story. Taylor didn't have a PhD, and Xerox decided that the head of a lab had to have a PhD. And so they got a guy I'll call Executive X in there. And in May, I've been designing little machines to make that enable us to go ahead with experiments with children and stuff. And had a meeting, and Executive X said, no, we've used up way too much political capital on Macs, which is a mainframe time-sharing machine. You can't talk to Xerox about making individual computers now. No way, forget it. And so that was one of the 2 times I actually cried at Park. But a couple of months later, Butler came by and said, have you got any money? And Chuck said, yes, I said, yes, about 230K. And how would you like us to build your little machine? I'd like it fine. You want a kitty comp, Butler wants a PDB-10 in a suitcase, and I want to make a 10 times faster Nova. What about Executive X? Well, he's away on the East Coast for a few months. Chuck has a bet with Bill Vidic that he can do a whole system in 3 months. Holy shit. And so the most famous thing that was ever done by Park, which is this thing that Steve saw that led to the Macintosh and the user interface was done on and stuff. This machine, the Alto, was actually an illegal project. And Executive X came back around Christmas time in the middle of this project and tried to quash it. And fortunately, there were forces that defeated this guy. And I can explain what happened to this Executive X in Q&A if we ever get there. But we had to make 100 Altos. And we turned out 2 or 3 a week. And people just, we only had a few technicians, but everybody had done this kind of stuff when they were teenagers and stuff. So whenever you had a few hours, you went down to the basement of this building and wired up some boards and did some soldering and stuff. And now here's an important slide. Why were we making time machines? So the basic idea is suppose you have an intuition that feels cosmic, like a little flat screen personal computer for children of all ages. And you can't build it. But you look around and there is a favorable exponential called Moore's Law, which you could believe in if you wanted to. You could take this out. 30 years is 20 doublings. So you get about a factor of 1 million to play with out there. And then the important idea here is you bring the idea back to 10 to 15 years out and then ask, can something be done here that is worthwhile? And if the answer is yes, you now just spend money, because Moore's Law means that things are going to get cheaper, which means if you spend a lot more money now, you can get what's going to be cheap in 10 years. And that's what we decided to do. Spend a lot of money, make hundreds of these guys. Why? Well, software is much, much harder uh, uh, than hardware. And we realized we're going to have to invent the genre. This was not knowing what a user interface should be like. We were going to have to do experiments. We didn't know how to deal with media or anything else like this. And so it's going to take a while to do the software. And if we did the software on today's computers, we'd be in the past by the time we got done. This way we spent, instead of spending, for computers that would cost $2,000 15 years out, we were spending 22 or 23,000, about a factor of 10 more to get them now. And that allowed this to be done. You could do those hundreds of experiments to find out what the user interface could be like. This is what Steve Jobs saw when he came to Park. Here is the first version that became Microsoft Word, that made billions for Microsoft, done originally at Park. And here's the first modern user interface for email. And there are many other things. All of these things were done in this period of time that we've carved out for ourselves. And that allows you to do research in the future. And that was a big deal. And I think the capper to this story is you just have to remember that the Alto was originally done against Xerox's wishes. And we eventually made, the Altos turned out to be really popular. So over the decade, we eventually made about 2,000 of them and gave them to colleges. We gave them to the White House Executive Office Building and so forth. And the second version of the printers, they were makeable in quantity. Each printer would serve at least 5 or 6 people. And so we made about 30 of those. And then how do you connect all this stuff together? Well, Chuck Thacker pointed out inside a coax is radio, can be radio. And we can put norms, aloha in that inside of a coax. And here's one of the earliest diagrams. This turned out to be a huge, huge win. It was so simple. It was so reliable. There was nothing to compete with it anywhere else. And of course, once that happened, Ron Ryder, now using an Alto as a server, put the first laser printer on the Ethernet. And yeah, I think so. Another little story here, which has some bearing on questions I've been asked for this conference, is Ted Kaler and Dan Ingalls were working for somebody else down the hall, but we were talking in the hallway, and Ted said, well, how large would be the kernel of the most powerful language in the world? And because I'd seen what McCarthy had done, I said, oh, it's a half page of code, whatever it is. And these guys said, prove it. And so I won't read this. Somebody can ask me to explain it in questions if we have time. But it's basically doing Goldilocks math on what McCarthy had done. And there's the t-shirt. And a month later, I came back from a trip and found that Dan had implemented. So like with Steve Russell and Lisp, all of a sudden we had a working Smalltalk. There it was out of nothing and in a month. And so we started using it. And there's some things here that we can talk about later, but what was interesting is that Smalltalk was continually being changed because it contained its own tools for changing it. So we did 5 versions inside of Park. And by the way, the Smalltalk that's still being used today outside 45 years later, is still Smalltalk 80. Nobody did. Why? Because a lot of the ideas in Smalltalk are completely obsolete. Moore's law marches on. We were keeping pace and ahead of Moore's law. But the culture on the outside was a culture that was used to accepting, especially in the 80s, started accepting tools from vendors, did not think of themselves as tool makers, builders, or modifiers. And as a result, the programming practices today are very recognizable. I should not be able to recognize anything about how programming is done today, but in fact, the languages are about of the same power. The interactive development environments are maybe where there are any, they're only slightly more powerful. Most code is still not done as live code and so forth. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about or not, but it's what happened when commercialization happened completely changed everything that was the case in research in the 60s and 70s. And we got something completely different. So here's, I've got just enough time to show you this. So here's Marion Goldine. Now, what is she doing here? She is actually, it's not that she's making a tree for you. She's demonstrating this application. She did this application herself. So this application to allow you to draw things and select your drawing tools from menu. Like here, she's getting a dot. That was her creation. This was to see, could a 12-year-old do their own application in a sufficiently high-level language? And the answer is yes. So there are many other examples like that, but let that stick in your mind. Okay, so into the multidisciplinary stuff. This is just a tiny part of what we did. Basically, everybody there was interested in more than just computing, interested in more than just science and math. So one perspective on humans is that we're very theatrical. And the reason theater works at all with humans is because of our brains are rather theatrical. And our little theaters in our brains are much smaller than we realize. We're much more like animals than we realize. We're much more culturally shaped than we think. And we have many different minds. So iconic here is a stand-in for things that are configurable. So it can be hearing, can be smell, can be vision. We only have one body. So we're in conflict with ourselves. So these especially contributed to the design of the user interface. But all of these are really important. And I decided to show you this middle one, that we are much more non-human than we assume. And I found the first movie of a non-human showing loss aversion. So you put something in a calabash here, food, the monkey grabs it. See, he's caught. He can let that food go anytime. but he can't get the food out he can't get his hand out without letting it go. So they're going to catch him and eat his brains. This is how they catch monkeys in Burma. Isn't that amazing? So this one is a common bias in most animals. You give something to somebody and another animal and try and take it back, and they will grab onto it like mad. But the human refinement of this that every executive that I've ever met is prone to is the sunk cost cognitive bias, which is a mostly false belief that the money that you put into something means that it's worth more. Whereas the right strategy is to continuously reevaluate and cut your losses whenever you see that you must. Most places will not do it. They hang on to really bad ideas for a really long time, partly because they put so much effort on dealing with the really bad ideas rather than understanding that the ideas are really bad. Okay, two opposing things. We're aware of about 100 things visually, but we can only pay attention to 3, 4, or 5 at the same time. So a lot of user interface is managing attention. You've got to give them the world, but you also have to make the world not be too noisy. I'm sorry that I had to admit talking about the ArcMac group at MIT because we got lots of ideas from them. And here's some of the many systems we did through the years, showing different evolutions. And by the way, because the Alto was microcoded, it could really animate like you've never seen on a machine done in 1973. And this is a little bit too small here, so we'll show you the Xerox Dorado here. And this slide was actually done in Smalltalk 78, which was the Smalltalk that Steve saw. So the question is, why is this arrow here? The answer is this interface is not like the Macs. This interface is composed of multiple project areas. So this is one whole project area. And when I switch to another project area, I'll have a completely separate environment. And if you think about it, this is a way you can do slide presentations and preserve everything the computer can do. What you don't want is something stupid like PowerPoint or Keynote. You want to be able to use the whole machine on everything, and you do that by changing environments. So if we go to the next one, so the famous interacting. So here's the character recognizer being used to say, okay, I want to flush left, flush right. Painting interface is close to the painting because you have to go back and forth to it. And so this is a painting I originally did like 50 years ago. And go to another one of these. Here's what we call an active essay. So notice down in the lower left-hand corner, this looks like an active essay, but she's actually put in a programmatical thing to show what she's allowing the reader to program. So Joe turned 45. Joe is the name of the box. Joe grow by 100. And now she's showing you that she did her painting app by making different versions of Joe. Okay, so here's an answer to Lick's question, what is communication? One way to think of it for this GUI is it's an extension of the gesture. So when we're talking to someone, we're actually pointing to things and what we hope is common in our thought clouds. And so our solution is, well, let's put on the screen what the computer is willing to talk about, and we can talk about it. And we can literally point, touch and drag, like when we bring a window to the top, we've changed the topic of conversation. The computer knows what that is. Everything is active. There aren't any modes. Being able to undo is critical. Here's Jerry Brenner 101. And the top 8 disciplines that were used to invent this GUI that is still around today, still handling probably millions of applications, many of which were dreamed up after the GUI was invented, but it was invented as a general communications mechanism. So it basically takes a lot of knowledge in each of these areas combined in a synergistic way to pull this off. Okay, so here are 2 splotches of paint. That's what I've given you in this history. Now it looks like a pearl earring. And if you've ever seen Vermeer, you don't realize that you think he's a realistic painter, but he was actually an impressionist. He didn't put anything in there that was like the real thing. He put in there what you would react to as the real thing. And so the rest of this talk can be found in the literature in various ways, various places and stuff. And thank you for letting me present to you the pearl earring. There are many things written during the time, and there are various histories. If you're only going to read one book, read this book. It's the most comprehensive. This is an essay I wrote praising the culture. Might be interesting to you. And I think, yes, it's 7:09. So there's theoretically some time left. I've got another little section, but I think this would be a good time to pause for questions.
Hi, Alan. Yeah, thank you very, very much for this talk. So the first question will be from Amir. So Amir, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, yeah, unmuting on Zoom is always a challenge. So yeah, I guess this is kind of a two-part question. They can be related, but they don't have to be. So the first one is, can you elaborate on the development of Smalltalk? And oh, what? Sorry, what was
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I didn't know what I heard there. And the second one is, how did your own early training in biology influence you? That question's like really significant to me because I'm not a computer scientist by trade. I'm a climate scientist. And so I'm wondering like what specific biological principles, cell signaling, development, modularity, homeostasis, immune defense. I remember part of your prospectus, you had many references to like complex systems and dynamical systems in both human and environmental biology. And so which of these most directly informed your idea of objects and messages, and which one do you wish you'd borrowed earlier?
Well,
Thank you.
yes, I gave 6 things that I saw early in graduate school. Um, I had just finished a double degree in pure math and molecular biology. And I was frankly too exhausted to think about going to grad school in either one of them. And I had worked my way through school as a programmer. And, I knew I didn't know anything about computing. It was just a way of earning my tuition and living and stuff while I was doing it. I thought I could take a rest and find out something about computing if I went somewhere that had a master's degree. This is 1966, and somewhere that had a master's degree in it. And I happened to stumble in to an Arbor project. I'd never heard of Arbor before. I didn't know what they'd been doing or anything. And so when I saw the 6 things I listed there, which were all computer things, I also thought of biology. And again, this is like I was saying, you have to be careful with analogies. This is like Goldilocks math. There's a Goldilocks biology here, because the scale factors in biology are truly enormous. And so much of the stuff that biology uses just for life is not really applicable even today. Some of it is, but the wonderful thing about biology, it was so much more complicated than any computer system, is it made working on computer systems rather fun and not intimidating at all. That's what a biologist brought into it. This is nothing. Of course, it's complicated enough to be a lot of work. But even the internet, if you think about it, has billions of nodes on it. And each node is a computer with stuff in it. But the human body has 10 trillion cells of our DNA alone. And each cell has many information processes going on, some as fast as 1 or 2 microseconds. Yeah, so if you look at a human body and forget about the 90 trillion microorganisms we also have in there, making analogies to that is not that helpful. But what you can get out of it is a few important things, and some of these were used at Park. For instance, the internet, and let's go even simpler, the Ethernet, which is really simple. There was a physicist from Bell Labs in the physics lab at Park who just flatly said the Ethernet cannot work. And when pressed on it, he had the unfortunate reason that, well, we tried it at Bell Labs and we couldn't make it work. And so his idea was that if they couldn't make it work at Bell Labs, we couldn't make it work at Park. But the problem with what does work? Well, one of the ideas, one of the principles we came up with is, instead of using math like queuing theory, which came in handy in a number of places, another way of thinking about it, which is a more biological way of thinking about it, is how about a collection of overlapping heuristics that together will cover any problem space, any problems that are going to arise. So, for instance, the internet is done that way. The internet has about, the TCP part of the internet has about a dozen different things that are operating more or less independently of each other. And the claim of the designers, it was a very good claim, was that these things working together are going to catch any important error. And of course, our gods were people like Shannon and Hamming. And everybody was extremely interested in the most maybe one, as interesting as relativity was Shannon's proof that if the noise in a system has any limit, like if you limit it to only like 0.1% noise, you're still guaranteed to make a perfect system. And that is a really important, mind-blowing fact. And biology uses this every which way as a large principle. And so a lot of the things that were done there in building systems were done in a way where the system persists and the components change. So the internet, for example, I don't believe has any of the original hardware or software left in it, yet it's never been taken down. The internet had to keep on working while every part of it was changing out. And this is very like, if you like analogies, this is biologists know that living systems like us, we recycle all of our atoms about every 7 years. Our atoms. And yet, so we're kind of a pattern moving through time and space. The materials that make us up are ephemeral, but the processes persist because the materials are replaced in a graceful. So those are big ideas from biology. And those are the ones that we really looked at. We didn't look at trying to do things like developmental biology. We didn't look at trying to do things the way cells do things. But there's this larger idea of modularity, and that as you scale up, the components have to be able to contribute without knowing very much about what the whole system is doing. They still have to contribute. And that's one of the main problems that computing has had. The internet people did a really good job. The web people did a terrible job, just to put out two contract. They're just two different groups, two different ways of thinking about things, and two different results.
We should move on to the next question from Ilio Catalo. If you want to go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Alan. Thank you for your talk. It was great to hear about the ideas that led to the work at Xerox PARC and Smalltalk. My question is about ideas that became possible because of it. In the past, you praised the art of the meta object protocol for capturing the spirit of object-oriented programming. And in class, so in the common Lisp object system, you achieve late binding through multi-methods. And I believe this approach departs from the encapsulation model that we use in Smalltalk, where objects are fully encapsulating and they interpret messages without exposing their internals. Since in class methods, you often need to access the internal state of multiple objects to compute a result. So in Smalltalk, for instance, a way to model a spaceship colliding with an obstacle is to have two objects negotiate the extent of the damage by messaging each other, probably in terms of their physical model, like mass or velocity. In contrast, in class, the collide method would directly manipulate the object internals. So my question is, do you see this as a fundamental difference in how the two systems view object orientation, or it is an alternative way?
I got a general reply, which is the craziest thing is that Smalltalk is still around, or anything from back then, because look, the thing that's wrong, really wrong here, is there's been no Moore's law for software. If you think about what the hardware, Smalltalk was originally done on a machine that had 64K bytes as its working memory and used another 64K bytes for 1 bit per point display. And Smalltalk was a practical working system for its time. I think it was the greatest thing the most interesting programming language of the 70s. But goodness gracious, we've been 45 years since 1980, right? And somebody can divide 1.5 into 45, but it's probably, like 30 doublings or so, which is at least a billion change in hardware. And the hardware architectures have not gotten much better because of, partly because of Microsoft's stuff running on old 8080 type architectures, 86 architectures. And so very few changes were made to make the hardware suitable for very high level languages, because it was made money for Intel to just keep on making it faster. And that's not the same as making it better. It took a long time for GPUs to come in, just because people said, hey, it's in a few years, the hardware will catch up and we'll be able to do graphics faster. And the answer is no. You need different hardware for different purposes. And if you're going to do really higher level languages, even Smalltalk in a reasonable way, you have to have a better architecture for running them, or else you're behind the 8 ball all the way. So the thing I say is, look, it's like the corresponding statement about AI is it doesn't matter whether AI is being done well or badly right now. The problem is that whatever it is hooked onto the internet, which is the industrial revolution of being able to make billions of inexpensive copies and distributing them everywhere. So the danger of AI is not whether it's good or bad, but because it's active and it's there. And the danger of this way of thinking about software is, like, people ask me about Smalltalk all the time, and I haven't thought about Smalltalk for years because it was a creature of its time. And we changed it so often because we kept on understanding better ways of doing it. And the same thing goes for MOP, which I love that book. The first section of that book is one of my favorite sections, but it's not about what the goals of software should be today, not even close. So clinging to it means people, this is the monkey in the calabash being trapped, and the executives with worrying about sunk costs and complete bullshit. That pink and blue diagram I did, where the what is actually needed is the thing, that's what you got to figure out for the field. What is actually needed? And I can tell you, it's not AI, it's not JavaScript, it's not Smalltalk, it's not meta object pro, it's none of those things. Because you have to look at what is it out there, and it's a system that's scaled by, as it was intended to, scaled by 10 orders of magnitude or so, and different things have to be done, and there's more resources for doing those different things, but they aren't being done. So there was a question that I more or less sent on its way, but it was about, don't people get in trouble doing message-oriented architectures? Well, the internet is the largest object-oriented system in the world. It's billions of encapsulated things, namely real hardware machines. That's what an object is in my definition of it. It's an encapsulated machine, virtual or real. There are billions of them. They're hooked together, and the internet, the only thing that's ever crashed on the internet is bad software done by other people inside those machines. The guys who did the architecture of the internet and the protocol for it made an effectively uncrashable system. The internet itself has never crashed. Think about that. It's so good that most computer people don't even think of it as a computer artifact. They think of it now as a natural resource. It's like the Grand Canyon, something that's already there for us. God gave us the internet. And that instead, they should look at it and try and understand why it works, because you can build software systems that are as complex and interconnected as the internet that will not crash. And the outstanding simple example is the internet itself. Come on. Yeah. So this is why the point of view is worth 80 IQ points idea. If you stay in the pink plane and reality scales, so you need to get into the blue plane to even see it. And you cling to the pink plane, you're in trouble. The human race is in trouble.
Thank you, Ellen. We have to stop here, unfortunately, as the next speaker, it's time for the next speaker. But yeah, thank you very, very much for your talk.
Great.
An amazing talk.
And thank you, Yevgenia. Hey.
Thank you, Alan. That's
Thank
a
you,
very
Alan.
good talk. Thank you.
Thank you.